Hey guys, it's Chris at Highline Guitars. You're watching another one of my YouTube guitar building videos. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I hope that by the end of this video, I'll have earned your subscription. And of course, to everyone else who's watching, I hope you'll consider at least giving the video a thumbs up. What I'm going to talk about in today's video are a couple of the different tools that are commonly used to level frets, and what you should consider if you're planning to purchase one to do your own fret leveling work. Now, I've had experiences with a number of different tools over the years. In fact, when I first started building guitars years ago, this was before the internet really is where it's at today, I had read a book on the subject of guitar building, and in this book, the author recommended using a 14-inch long machinist's file, which you would then set onto the fretboard to level the frets. And yeah, it worked fairly well, but it was kind of crude. It was awkward to hold, and I never really felt like it was doing the best job that is really required when it comes to leveling frets. So then along came the internet and tools like this one. This is a 16-inch long fret leveling beam. The surfaces are machined perfectly flat so that you can attach 1-inch wide sandpaper. And I typically have 220 grit on one side and 320 grit on the other. 220 is great for really problematic frets where you have a lot of leveling to do, but they also really work well with stainless steel frets. And then the 320 is what I use to level nickel silver frets. This one is made out of steel, which is what I recommend if you can find it. A lot of these beams are made out of aluminum. And the problem with aluminum is, and it really is something that's only of concern to builders who are doing a tremendous amount of leveling, or building a lot of guitars, doing a lot of repair work, and they're constantly leveling. Aluminum is damaged very easily. You can drop the tool, you can bump it against things, and that can ding the surface. And when you ding that surface, it's useless because it will affect the accuracy of your fret leveling work. So I prefer using steel. Now, these typically come in two different lengths. You've got your, like I just showed you, the 16-inch and then the shorter 8-inch. And obviously the 8-inch is going to be a lot cheaper, but it doesn't work the same as the 16-inch. The 16-inch shines when you're having to level all the frets on a fretboard all at once. When you use this tool, it's covering almost all of the frets on the fretboard. So as you move it back and forth, your 15th fret is getting leveled to the same level as, say, the 2nd or 3rd fret. So it really does a great job of precisely leveling all the frets quickly all at once. The shorter fret beams, now this still will work. You could level all the frets, but if you're at the back of the fretboard and you're leveling, and as you move it forward, the frets towards the front of the fretboard, towards the nut, are possibly going to be leveled slightly differently than the frets at the back. So you have to keep that in mind when considering this tool. What I typically use this for is spot leveling. If I've got a high fret in a couple of spots, I like to use this beam to level those frets. Now, if I have the strings on already, and I know I have some high spots that need to be addressed, I do have another tool, and I'm actually going to talk about this in a future episode, and that is StewMac's Fret Kisser. So again, I'll be talking about this one in a future episode because there's a little bit more that's involved with that. But again, for spot leveling, I like to use this shorter 8-inch beam. I also like to use this if I have to generate fall off on the fretboard from about the 15th fret to the last fret, the 24th fret or 22nd, whatever, however many frets there are. And the reason why this works well for that is because you're only covering that small space, that just those last frets. So you don't have to worry about it affecting the other frets. When you're generating fall off, what you're doing is you're grinding down your last frets so that each fret from 24 to 15 is on a slight uphill or downhill from the 15th fret down to the 24th fret. It gradually, each fret gets lower and lower and lower, and that allows you to have, it controls string buzz, because most of your vibration of the strings is happening from about the 15th fret to the 24th fret. So if you can grind those down lower than the other frets, you won't have that potential for string buzz. It's not always necessary, but if I find on a guitar that I built that it might be beneficial, I can use this to achieve that. And usually what I'll do is I'll put several layers of masking tape over my 13th or 14th fret, so that when I place the beam onto the frets, it's sitting at a slight downhill angle. That masking tape is lifting it off of those frets, and as I grind it, it will reduce those frets so that that 24th fret is lower than the one before it, and so on all the way up to the 15th fret. It's kind of hard to talk about this stuff. It's a lot of it is theoretical, and it can be kind of difficult to verbally explain what's going on. But I think most of you watching this probably have an understanding of what fret fall off is. It's an old acoustic guitar trick, because with acoustic guitars, in that area, the last frets on the neck can have a real issue with string buzz. That's more of a problem with acoustic guitars than it is with electric guitars, but it can be a problem with electric guitars. So inducing that fall off with your fret leveling beam can help it. Now, the other type of fret leveling tool that I actually use more often than any other is my homemade fret radius sanding block. And this is really no different than the radius sanding blocks that you can find on the internet. Some are made of wood, some are made out of extruded aluminum, and I've also started to see beams that are made out of 3D printed plastic. So those are basically the same thing. This one, however, is one of a kind. I made this on my CNC machine. I had a piece of 3.5 inch wide, 1/2 inch thick aluminum sitting in my shop. So what I did was I put it on my CNC machine and I ground out a 12-inch radius on this beam. It's 20 inches long, so when I put it on the fretboard, it covers all the frets. And with either 220 or 320 grit sanding paper and just the weight of the beam, I can do just a couple of back and forth strokes and completely level all my frets. So this is the tool that I prefer to use. However, it's a 12-inch radius, and it's the only one that I've got. If I had to build a guitar that was going to have, say, a 10-inch radius or something different other than 12 inches, this beam won't work. I would have to either make a new beam or purchase one. And I really don't do enough radius fretboards other than the 12-inch radius. So for me, there's no reason to make another one. But if that was to become common, then I would make just another one of these things, because they're pretty cheap and easy to make. When it comes to using a radius sanding block to level your frets, I have had folks comment that there is a concern about accuracy, because if you are radiusing the fretboard with a 12-inch radius sanding beam or sanding block, and then you're using that same tool to radius the frets, it's not taking into consideration the fact that the radius at the top of the frets is going to be slightly different than the radius of the fretboard. In truth, the top of the frets is going to be it's going to have a slightly greater radius. So let's say, for the sake of discussion, the fret wire has a height off the fretboard of 0.047 inches. The fretboard has a radius of 12 inches. Therefore, the top of the frets is actually 12.047 inches. So it's slightly different than the radius of the fretboard because of its height. So if you're using a 12-inch radius sanding block to radius the frets at 12.047 inches in radius, it's not going to be accurate. Well, yes, that's true, but in the real world, I would challenge you to be able to tell the difference between a 12-inch radius and a 12.047-inch radius. Yes, even though our fingers and our brains are capable of detecting differences, subtle differences in surface shapes, that's really only extends to being able to tell the difference between a 12-inch radius and maybe a 10-inch radius. It's very difficult for the human brain to know the difference between something as subtle and as small as 0.047 inches. So you're fine to use a 12-inch radius sanding block to level your frets, even though there is that slight difference in radius. You're just not going to be able to tell, and it's not really going to have any effect whatsoever on the quality of your radius of your, or the level of your fretboard and your frets. So if you want to use a radius sanding block, not only to radius your fretboard, but also to level your frets, you absolutely can do that. And I would encourage you to do that, because then you don't have to buy a lot of different tools, especially if you're only making one guitar with one radius. And just like the leveling beams, you can get short ones like 8 inches in length, or longer ones, which are like 16 to 18 inches in length. For the most part, I would recommend that you go with the longer beam. And this is true with the radius sanding blocks as well as the beams. I think the longer ones are more useful, and they're going to do a great job every time out. And you can also do your fall off with these with the longer beams. You certainly are not limited to only using the 8-inch. If you want to do fall off but only have the longer beam, it's still going to work. Now, as far as spot leveling, those longer beams don't necessarily work, because you're not really spot leveling, you're leveling all of the frets at the same time. Now, another question that I'd like to address with respect to these leveling tools is the type of sandpaper that you can use. And in truth, in my experience, it doesn't matter. The two types of sandpaper we generally use are either aluminum oxide, which is most of the sandpaper that you use when you're sanding wood, or silicon carbide, which is that black, wet, dry, waterproof sanding paper. It doesn't matter. They both do essentially the same thing. For stainless steel, I will typically, I try to use 320, because it leaves sanding scratches that are much easier to polish out. But there are occasions when I've had to step back to 220 grit in order to get the frets level. For nickel silver, I try to do either 400, and if necessary, I'll step back to 320. So it doesn't matter whether you're using aluminum oxide or silicon carbide. And I generally am using the grits between 220 and 400. So that's the type of sandpaper I find works best for this. I hope you found this video useful, especially if you're thinking about purchasing the tools that you need to level your own frets. And really, I think the bottom line is, whether you go with a radius sanding block or one of these long straight leveling beams, you can't go wrong. However, like I said earlier, my tool of choice is the radius sanding block, because it does the work so fast. But I do a lot of guitars. So if you're only making one guitar, you might just want to go ahead and purchase one of these and use that to level the frets. And remember, these aren't terribly expensive. So even though you might think, well, geez, I'm only making one guitar, why would I want to invest in one of those? Well, having one of those tools is a great tool to have if you find yourself potentially maintaining a lot of your guitars, and you may do some refrets in the future, or you may find that you need to do a fret leveling because of some fret buzz problems and just plain worn frets. And having one of these inexpensive beams is a great tool to have in your workshop, because it's going to help you to do that work yourself rather than having to pay somebody to do it for you. At any rate, if you've enjoyed this video and found it useful, please consider giving it a thumbs up. And if you would like to help support this channel financially, because that's always important, these videos can be expensive to make, consider visiting my eGuitar Plans website. There's a link in the description below, and purchasing plans for building guitars as well as the tools that we use to build guitars. Or you can head to my YouTube merch shelf, which is displayed down below the description for this video, and there you can buy all those same plans, but you can also purchase some t-shirts as well and show your love for Highline guitars. At any rate, until the next episode, as always, take care, stay safe, and I hope you'll be back for the next episode.